Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. As I said, I'm Emily. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library. We are so thrilled to be hosting tonight's Camden Conference event. I'm happy to turn it over to Bill Duchovner, who serves on the Camden Conference Events Committee, and will be introducing tonight's speaker. Bill, you go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Em. On behalf of the Camden Conference, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. We would like to thank Rockland Public Library for making these programs possible. The Camden Conference is a nonprofit, nonpartisan citizens forum driven almost exclusively by volunteers from our community. The mission of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discourse on world issues. In keeping with our mission, we offer a series of community events leading up to our annual weekend conference. These free events are intended to provide background on the yearly topic and to touch on areas related to the February conference that may not be covered in its three-day format. The views, opinions, and positions expressed by our presenters are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect those of the Camden Conference. This year's conference, our 35th, Europe, Challenged at Home and Abroad, will take place February 25th through 27th, 2022, live from the Strom Auditorium at Camden Regional High School. COVID-19 protocols will be followed. Tonight, as part of the conference community event series, it is my pleasure to introduce a long-standing friend of the Camden Conference, Matt Ward. Matt is a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer serving from 1967 to 1996, specializing in economic, developmental, and trade issues, with his final job as a senior inspector. During his diplomatic career, he dealt extensively with European economic community institutions. In the Bush 41 White House, he was director for trade issues involving the European Free Trade Association and European Economies in transition. Matt is a graduate of Georgetown School of Foreign Service with accolades and achievements too numerous to name here. Matt will share his insights into Europe, the New World Order, and the 21st century that he has distilled from his many years engaged for the United States, in Europe, and with our European partners. Welcome, Matt. The audience is yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. I didn't know that my accolades were too numerous to list. Nevertheless, it's nice to hear somebody say nice things about you. Let me just begin by saying I think in recent international issues that the U.S. looks at and considers, Europe has often been overlooked. And it's overlooked, I think, in part because we think we know it very well. Most Americans are descendants of Europeans without really knowing it. And it is hard to put European issues in a 5-second soundbite. Europe is just too complicated and too diverse and statistically hard to understand. So we move our concerns to other places that seem to make the news and get more hype, I suppose. Europe itself, we easily can say that Europe is a continent that is in fact a peninsula on the large Eurasian continent. That's a European point of view, that Europe is a continent all by itself, because many of the other societies in the world consider that whole continent to be one, and Europe is a subcontinent. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan is a subcontinent, and China is a subcontinent. And then what in the world do you do with Russia east of the Urals? Are those people Europeans or Asians, for heaven's sake? I think we're going to examine some of that. But the reason we think of Europe as an entity is because about 500 years ago, Europeans started to develop an identity within themselves of being European. So other than the geography and the demography, the history of Europe becomes important. After all, if you go back far enough, what we call Europe was largely inhabited by Celts, and then Germanic tribes came in and pushed the Celts off to the side, and then other Slavic immigrants came in. So it's hard to figure out what a true European is, but Europe is nevertheless an identity. And the beginning of a European identity, believe it or not, didn't start till about 500 years ago. It's relatively new. The people living in Europe in the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, before the Middle Ages, even under the Roman Empire, did not think of themselves necessarily as Europeans. I mean, if you talk to some guy who was a blacksmith in Sussex, England, he was John the Smith. Maybe he would say he was from Sussex. If you talk to somebody in what eventually became Swabia or Switzerland, they were a Schmidt if they did the same thing. If they belonged to something, they had a concept of belonging to something larger. For most people living in that geographic area, it was Christendom. That was the sort of universal connecting idea. It wasn't until a couple of major events happened in Europe that Europeans had to look at themselves differently. The first big event was the Reformation. That was the end of the idea of a universal Christendom. And it was one of those events, depending on which side you were on, that meant the end of civilization as we know it. No longer could you identify with this sort of universal philosophy. And a lot of people decided that was intolerable and they had to murder one another over that. At the same time that was happening, the whole issue of trade with the people living in what was Europe changed. The New World had been discovered. The Portuguese had figured you could sail around Africa and get all of the wonders of the Indies and China and bring them back without going through the troublesome Middle East. That meant that the Mediterranean was no longer the commercial center. And now places on the Atlantic coast were. It's during this period, I have a map here of Europe in 1648. Political power started to shift. And rather than sort of the knowledgeable world and learning being controlled in the upper Mediterranean and by small dukedoms, towns in northern Italy, one family started to, largely by marriage and by just inheriting property, and that was the Habsburgs. Finally, in the middle of the 1500s, Charles V, the fifth Habsburg, ruled Iberia, Austria. I think he was the King of Hungary. He was the Duke of Burgundy. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. And he made it his goal to sort of have a unified political system and uniform rules and regulations and uniform religion. And he was a defender of the old faith in Rome. There were a lot of people who didn't necessarily want to be part of the Habsburg Empire, or at least didn't necessarily want to be Catholic. They wanted to be Lutherans. Some of them wanted to be Calvinists. And the French, of course, wanted to be French, which meant that they were glad to provide money to the Lutheran armies in Sweden while they persecuted the Huguenots in their own country. Now, when we learn this period of European history, it's always a period of one war after another: the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the League of Cognac, whatever. But it was also a remarkable period of diplomacy. If you've got people fighting all the time, you have to have people trying to settle these issues. And this is what happened. Suddenly, you also developed, for economic reasons, a movement from the countryside into the city. You had multinational trade in commodities for the first time, in part because the Dutch designed an inexpensive sailing ship that could move goods around waterways easily, but wheat that was grown in Poland could be sold in England. You had a whole different attitude, and you had two groups of people largely. The people who wanted to fight over what was called the confessional and the territory, and the people who wanted largely the burgeoning middle class that did business, who wanted a peaceful atmosphere in which to trade goods, raise their children, etc. And you had almost all of these kingdoms had more or less enlightened, educated leaders who wanted what was best for their own people, but all of whom realized that you could only get this with peace. The other thing you could only get was you couldn't have multiple tiny little countries with different standards. If you were going to be prosperous, goods had to move in some regularity. There had to be standardization of weights. There had to be standardization of coinage and of money, and it had to be dependable. So you began to have true international banking. You had to have genuine currency exchanges for the first time. And the people who did this began to think of themselves as different from the rest of the world. And in fact, they were. The science, the ideas of somehow bringing together disparate languages and ideas and religious ideas, political ideas into one. This started in the 16th century, along with developments in science. And in 1555, at the Peace of Augsburg, a landmark decision was made by all of the leaders in Europe. And that was, there was no longer going to be a universal definition of Christianity. That each prince could decide for his subjects what would be the acceptable definition of Christianity. Now, that only accepted two definitions. You had to either be a Lutheran or a Catholic. But what was remarkable in those days was that if you were a Catholic ending up in a Lutheran place like Brandenburg or Württemberg, you could move and you had to be accepted in a neighboring Catholic country. Same thing, if you were a Lutheran in a Catholic country, then you could move. And as I used to say, you could roll up your farm, put it under your arm, and go to another, but you had to be accepted. This was a great boon to the intellectual life of Europe, and it meant that people with other than agricultural skills, craftsmen, could go to places where they would earn incomes and where they felt comfortable living. Now, Peace of Augsburg didn't last very long. It was revolutionary when it happened, but there was this other group of people known as Calvinists who wanted in on the deal. This is what happens when you make an arrangement. There's always somebody else. And neither the Catholics or the Lutherans really wanted the Calvinists. So a whole new dimension of how Europe was going to organize itself, but based on the ideas that had led to the Peace of Augsburg. And so back Europeans went to war over religion and land and whatever else. But this time, interestingly enough, the various players, no matter who they were, whether you were the Margrave of Brandenburg or the Duke of Burgundy or the Holy Roman Emperor or the Pope or the King of France or the Queen of England, Elizabeth was then, you started to develop a core of permanent diplomats in cities around Europe who talked to one another. This was the birth of professional diplomacy. People who were trained, we think about advances in the military, but this was the beginning of the idea that there would always be some group of people in Geneva, let's say, who would accept, who would be willing to sit down at a table and try to figure out how do we solve whatever this problem is. And the solution was, how do we end wars and bring peace back? Never an easy thing to resolve. But in the many conferences that finally led up to the very historic Peace of Westphalia in 1648, where there was some degree of religious tolerance everywhere, even if you were a Catholic bishopric, you had to allow Protestants to live there. And now all of these solutions, I have to point out, were relative to other Christians, none of whom particularly wanted to be nice to the Jews, though the Pope himself did provide refuge for the Jews who were kicked out of Spain. If you weren't the dominant sort of official group, you were definitely second-class citizens. But the idea was you did have to tolerate people and have some kind of acceptance of difference. And there was the beginning of basic standards that would be the same through all countries. There was the realization that peace is better than war. Simple idea, but hard to. It was the beginning of the domino theory. It's the idea that if one little country falls, to the Catholics, to the Lutherans, to the Calvinists, whatever, everybody else is going to be pushed over. And we still have, that's a European idea. We dragged that out in Southeast Asia many years ago. Turned out it didn't work in Southeast Asia because Vietnam went to the people we thought were going to take over the rest of the area, and the rest of the area went on and did their own thing. Many of them, in fact, developing democratic societies. But lots of what we think of today as international standards were developed It was the beginning of the idea. There had always been the idea of a state that's an official territory headed by somebody who has power over other people. But for the first time, there was the beginning of the idea of a nation. And a nation is a family of human beings who share a common language, ethnicity, and history. At this period in European history, nobody really thought about putting them together, but it became an issue. Now, we followed that period when Europeans began to figure out how they could deal with one another and solve problems and do it in a uniquely European period to the next period I'm going to get to, which was the height of European influence worldwide. And we start that sort of with the French Revolution and end it with the First World War. One of the great ideas that came out of the early period of European identity was balance of power in politics. That if this group of people, you have one group of people who were Catholics, let's say, then you ought to have a balancing number that were Lutherans and maybe a few Calvinists. And you could get away with this in Europe because this was the period when the Baptists and the Methodists and the Mennonites and the Amish and the Quakers were shipped off to the New World. So you could get those people out of the way, but you could balance power, and anytime that balance was upset, the other actors would act as a rebalancing influence. So if the Margrave of Brandenburg decided he was going to take over a little duchy that was Catholic and turn them into Lutherans, then the Catholics and the Calvinists would get together. This is a lot of very high-minded thinking. It didn't work all that much, but it became part of European thinking. From the period of the French Revolution till the end of the First World War, Europe decided it was in the interest of the world for Europe to export these ideas and control other parts of the world. And essentially, great European powers did two things. They divided up the rest of the world, except for the Western Hemisphere, which by this time we already had these funny free thinkers in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, and New York, who said, not here. We're going to handle this place, even though the British Empire kept places like Canada, and Britain eventually became the greatest imperial power. But there was a whole issue of how you divided up the world so that it was balanced among European powers. The one example that I like to use, because it is classic and it still influences our policy thinking today, was what was called the Great Game. And that was the question of how the British Empire and Tsarist Russia divided up Central Europe. Essentially, a line had to be drawn from Constantinople east. And the Tsar wanted to control as much as he could down towards the south, and the British wanting to protect trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Middle East, and in India and Afghanistan, had a northern line. And how you controlled Persia, now Iran, the Ottoman Empire, how you influenced them, now Turkey. The eastern end of that line is almost exactly the border between Tibet and Xinjiang, Chinese call Xinjiang, and what used to be called Chinese Turkestan. Those are the Turkish populations, which today we call Uyghurs, but and Tibetans. And the solution for Europeans had absolutely nothing to do with what the people who lived there thought. The idea was that the British would control Tibet. That would be their back door into China, and the Russians would control Xinjiang. And both countries did their best to foment revolution and separatist movements. Any of this sound familiar? Who wins the great game? Who gets China? That was the goal at the end. But there's both good and bad. We now look back at the colonial period as largely bad, but in fact, what it did was it set in place an international standard for how people behaved internationally. European languages became world languages. International European customs became international. European religions were taught all over the world. And the Europeans were the first people back in the 15th, 16th century that began thinking about things like international law and how countries should deal with one another in some sort of system where everybody accepts the same standards, where everybody agrees we're going to do things a certain way. That hope for an international standard where great empires would determine the balance and keep things in balance. And people as late as 1910, 1912 were saying, war is impossible because the great powers have figured out what part of the world is theirs, and war would be unthinkable. It would ruin all of this. It would impoverish the world. Well, a Serbian nationalist killed the heir to the Austrian Empire, and numerous people encouraged one another to upset the balance, and the result was the First World War. And balance of power sort of became unfashionable. What was the world going to do? There could never, because of the position that European empires and the United States, the Western Hemisphere was largely the American empire. It was an economic empire, not a political one necessarily. What do you do at the end of this? How do we get back to a world where people can live with one another and not be killing one another hand over fist? And a guy named Woodrow Wilson came up with an idea to sort of scrap the balance of power issue and create some sort of an international order where there would be institutions that allowed people to settle disputes diplomatically, not militarily. His idea was things like the League of Nations. That was his first. And Wilson referred to that as a new world order. He was the first person to do that. But Europeans jumped on the bandwagon right away. They said, yes, this from their own experience, consultative conferences, rules that everybody shares. We now talk about a rule of law. We talk about a world in which there are basic rules and laws and people follow them. We American and European diplomats actually thought after the First World War that we could outlaw war. Didn't work that well. But in fact, the seed was planted, and there was then a second Great World War, more devastating than the first. And following that, certain things had changed. The First World War largely bankrupted all of the great European powers. And if it didn't, they were devastated by the Second World War. And the saving grace was the United States. There's a young man who was the Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, whose name was Franklin Roosevelt. And he was a big advocate of Woodrow Wilson's ideas about a new world order where there were international institutions. He blamed the failure of the first effort on the fact that the United States didn't participate. And he said this sort of new order wouldn't work unless at least all the great powers signed on and agreed to it. So this is really simplifying stuff, but he decided to retry with the United Nations and a world in which the United States sort of ensured that if you could settle things diplomatically, you did. Again, with economic assistance from the United States, Europeans looked at this and said, this is the solution. And that was the beginning of the idea that you could put together one Europe where people were still had their own national identity, but where they shared particularly economic interests. The first attempt was to bring together the coal and steel making community. Because if you in fact integrated the elements that went into making war machines, it would be harder to go to war. That was that simple thinking. And over the years from 1945 until today, with a few little problems in Yugoslavia, for the first time in almost 500 years, there has not been a war in Europe. Europeans are prosperous. They're able to deal with one another. I mean, we have thanked people like Robert Schuman and Jean Genet and early post-war German thinkers as well. But little by little, and it's a tug, it goes back and forth, there are always people in the community who say, why do we have these bureaucrats in Brussels? We want to do things our own way. We don't want to be told by Brussels how to behave. Most recently, the British, though a sentiment not shared in Scotland or Northern Ireland. So it's not perfect, but the important, I think, as we talk about Europe today is what the Europeans have accomplished since 1945 in practical purposes is simple stuff like weights and standards and how you deal with currency. I mean, they now have one currency. How you deal with economic problems that affect several different nations. And for the developing world, many of them who were European colonies and resented it, when you're trying to put together a legal system for your own country, it is so much easier to go to the European Union and say, how do you run your customs system? How does the postal system operate? How do you regulate banking? Because there's been so much more thought about this in Europe than there has in the United States, even though we've given it a lot of thought and we'd like the rest of the world to adopt our. So Europe is sort of a sleeping influence for the rest of the world. And it's a non-threatening influence. I will add just here another thing, that since 1945, Europe has become remarkably prosperous. It's a good place to live. It's a good place to raise children. And I know that we regularly, at some point, I'm going to throw a shoe at the television the next time someone tells me that China is the second largest economy in the world. First of all, what does that mean? But if you put all the European countries together, the European economy is much larger, much deeper, much more sophisticated. But we don't keep statistics that way. We keep statistics by national entity. So we keep statistics by Germany and Switzerland and Portugal and Lithuania. So if you have one great big territory with 1.4 billion people, the fact that the average income is $6,000 per person, and you compare that to the United States, which has 1/3 the number of people, maybe 1/4, but the average person has an income of 50,000, then it looks like it's the same sized economy. Wait until India comes on board. We're comparing apples and oranges, and I think we often forget in this mix where Europe is and the influence that Europe has and continues to have, sort of nice, quietly, nice little middle-class Europe. I am going to, the whole question of this is what happens now with Europe? Because we have had, in the last few years, a tendency, we had a world sort of committed to a new order led by the United States. And I would say that in the last few years, there seems to be less of an American commitment to lead the world in what is a genuinely diverse, multicultural, multi-political world where rules and laws are accepted and are made by everybody. So I will stop talking about Europe and listen to other people's ideas.
Well, thank you, Matt, very much. Do we have anyone who would like to unmute themselves and ask Matt a question? Or you can post something to the chat and I'll try to monitor that. If you don't want to.
I posted a couple of questions to the chat room already. Can you see those?
I cannot.
Well, I will give voice to them then. My first question was, you stated that there had been a sack of Rome sometime in the 16th century. And I was racking my brains and couldn't figure out who had sacked Rome in the 16th century.
Rome? Yes, it's, when we teach history here in the United States, there's some.
I learned history in Europe because my father was also a foreign service officer.
Okay. Well, who sacked Rome? In, let's say, around the 1520s, one of the Habsburgs, and you'll forgive me if I don't remember whether it's Rudolph or Ferdinand or Karl or Otto or somebody, but it may very well have been Charles V. Appointed himself the defender of the papacy without really the consent of any of the current popes, but he said that's what he was going to do. He was going to defend European Christianity the way it was intended to be. And he set out to sort of win back a lot of the German principalities and duchies from the Lutherans. And he was, this is where diplomacy really was astounding. And he managed to get on his side some of the moderate Lutherans who really saw the Calvinists as a threat, and some just well, he got part of some support from the kings of France at the same time, but he put together this remarkable army to push back Lutheran influence largely in Central Europe, but in France and Northern
Okay.
Italy and Switzerland and whatever else. And it was made up of French mercenaries. There used to be a German term I knew for German mercenaries who'd fight on all sides. You know, you just paid them well. And they were very modern. They had muskets and pickets and all of the advanced technology, and some Italian armies. And anyway,
Would those have been the Palatines?
it could have been, yes, but it was a remarkable mix. And
Because they were then shipped off to the US. They were
Yeah.
troublesome and were shipped off to the US.
well, a lot, these troublemakers always got shipped off. But this army, which was, I would say, 50% mercenaries,
Uh-huh.
at one point had finally conquered northern Italy on behalf of the Habsburgs, and supposedly were defending the papacy,
Mhm,
though the Pope really didn't want to be defended by them.
mhm.
Ferdinand or Carlos, whoever it was, realized he didn't have any money to pay them.
Uh-oh.
Then that's a problem when you hire mercenaries and they go out and, conquer on your behalf. So they wanted to be paid. He couldn't pay them. Well, what was the richest city in Italy at the time? There they were, on the very gates of Rome. And they just decided, we're going to go in there and plunder and rape and take whatever we want. And
Oh.
they slaughtered the Swiss guard. The Pope at the time locked himself up in Castello Sant'Angelo and said, I never wanted this in the first place. And they just basically went through Renaissance villas and took whatever they wanted. That was the sacking of Rome.
Thank you.
And that was sort of there are historians who believe that was the end of the Renaissance.
Uh-huh.
It was the end of a lot of the Renaissance was financed, in fact, by large grants from the papacy and by Northern Italian banking families who were pretty much looted, and that is sort of the point when people start talking about the remnants of the Renaissance moving to Belgium, to England,
Uh-huh.
Northern Europe. That was the sacking of Rome. It was not by Huns, or it was
No.
just by, unpaid mercenaries. But you have to remember, in the early 1500s, you also still had the effects of bubonic plague on the population. So this sort of stuff had a big effect economically on the Mediterranean.
I have a related question, or at least it's contemporary.
Mhm.
And that has to do with, you mentioned the Roman Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, but what about the Anglican Church? I mean, we have Elizabeth I there in England, and she was certainly
Honest to
someone
God,
to be reckoned with.
I know, poor Elizabeth. I say poor Elizabeth. She went out of her way to make the Church of England look Catholic. I mean,
The middle way. It was called the
Yeah.
middle way. It wasn't
Right.
Catholic.
and try to couldn't we get along with everybody? But she turned out to have annoyed everyone. The Lutherans didn't think she was Protestant enough. The Calvinists, that's ended up, being Cromwell, and those people thought that she was still, corrupted by Roman thinking. And the Spanish, I mean, the Spain's, Philip, who was the king of Spain at the time, the current Habsburg, England was his natural ally against the French. And instead, he and the Pope had to put together a great armada to send up there and convert these people, which only made the Bourbons more powerful in France. There wasn't a lot of intelligent thought on these things. And I always feel sorry for Elizabeth, because here she was presiding over a literary, scientific birth and trying to say, couldn't we just sort of like be old-fashioned Christians and not worry about the Pope? And didn't really work well. Eventually it did, but it took a lot of
Lives.
a lot of people dying unnecessarily. This was when I think in the long run, England and later to become Britain benefited by the turmoil on the continent.
Mhm.
I think
But- I was
Frederick-
just going to say, but England was one of the first countries to develop, the first political entity to develop a professional diplomatic corps was the papacy. But soon after that, France and Britain, and England did. Took the German principalities and the Spanish a longer time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Well-
Cory. We have a question from Kim Scott. I did not know that modern diplomacy began in Europe, but they have been much more effective, in my humble opinion, than the US, which has gutted its foreign service over the years in so many ways. Given your experience in that diplomatic world, is there hope for us to turn it around?
There is always hope. That is one thing we can always hang on to. Is it realistic? I don't know. I'll be honest and say, and I'll make a comparison. In most European countries, it is an honor and you are respected if you are a teacher. Certainly in European countries, you're respected if you introduce yourself as a diplomat. I mean, that's true. That has never really been the case in the United States. I mean, we have really good teachers, but I'm not sure they have the same position in society that you have in Europe. Or if you're a teacher, certainly the position that you have in places like China. But let me just correct something. There has always been diplomacy. That is, political leaders have always sent somebody to talk to the other guy, to try and solve things. The change in Europe was that you would have professional people. You were not the brother-in-law of Rudolph II, who was sent off to arrange a marriage with a French princess for his son. There's that kind of diplomacy. Then you went back home and persecuted your peasants. The idea that you had people who were trained, who regularly went to conferences, who were able to walk into a room and say, "Hi, how are you, Guillaume? You remember what we talked about 5 years ago," etc. That it was the beginning of a professional diplomatic corps, professional diplomatic services is what the Europeans are. I mean, and that has influenced what the rest of the world does. And it is not exclusively European anymore. I mean, one of the most professional diplomatic services in the world is Japanese, regardless of which China you recommend or recognize, the Republic of China on Taiwan or the People's Republic of China in Beijing. In international organizations, this whole new world order, but all Chinese governments have put a very high price on that, and they send their best. And I can remember being told once that probably the best diplomatic service in the world was the Brazilian one. So, you know, it's countries have taken this idea and invested very heavily in the idea of having good trained diplomats. I don't think we put the emphasis on it that many other countries do. That it's unfortunate, because if you're going to be the leader of the world, that's one of the things you would think you'd want to have.
Thank you. We have another sort of a corollary question, Matt. It says the arcane view of pre-21st century dogmas will be applicable to statecraft with burgeoning of PRC and emerging economies of South America, Africa, and especially India and Southeast Asia. Does it now stand that we are in need of a radical change to the definition of diplomacy?
Well, I have always said that diplomacy is just a really nice international word for politics. That in a society, and you don't have to be a democratic institution to have politics. All families have politics, you know. All countries have politics. All political parties have politics. You know, there's always people who are trying to figure out how to do something better, how to benefit themselves and their allies in life. So I don't know. I do think that more and more countries are seeing the importance. Maybe I'll put this: are seeing the importance of having really knowledgeable, trained diplomats. And the interesting thing that I have observed, and I don't know that this is just my observation, is that for developing countries, their best diplomats are being sent to the UN, to the World Trade Organization, to the World Health Organization, and are skilled in particular knowledge on how the international institutions operate and behave. I spent a great deal of my career in developing countries, and I can tell you, in any developing country, the United Nations and the United Nations representative and the representative of the United Nations Development Program and UNESCO and the World Health, these are important people. And we rarely hear about them in the United States. We, I think, still tend to promote and benefit those professional diplomats who have special and done well in bilateral relationships. In other words, somebody who is a knowledgeable China hand, someone who understands French politics and can deal with the French. Both of those groups deserve high honors just for attempting what they're doing. But I don't think that we reward or even encourage people to look at careers in international organizations. And that is really the foundation of the New World Order that at least Franklin Roosevelt, brought in. And I do want to say this. I think, reached the apex of the successful New World Order. That is, all countries cooperating with the end of the first Gulf War. I can remember President Bush, I was then working in the White House, giving a speech at the end when Iraq was pushed out of Kuwait. This was exactly what the UN was supposed to do. Kuwait was reestablished as an independent sovereign state. We were all successful. Virtually every country in the world supported the effort or abstained. That was it. And President Bush said, "We have a new world order." That was a remarkable statement. And I listened to commentators all over the American media saying, "What does that mean? Does that mean oil is important now?" What he was saying was what Franklin Roosevelt and what Woodrow Wilson imagined we finally have accomplished. But then, okay, then it's back to the old system. What do I get out of it? So it's a long answer to who knows.
The questioner posted a follow-up commentary saying the only diplomacy today and in the future will be corporations, vice government entities. The marketing of NWO version 2.0, all in Chinese characters, ?
Well, Chinese would say "bu zhi dao." I don't know. The Chinese, starting 35 years ago, required that you get into a Chinese university, you had to pass an exam in English, and it had to be American English. So I seriously doubt that Chinese is going to rival any of the European languages as a world organization. It's just too hard for the rest of the world to learn. It is as a student of the Chinese language, it's a beautiful language. It's a very utilitarian language. It's an artful language, but it's not easy to learn. And there are so many subsets of it. We think of Chinese, and we talk about Mandarin. The Chinese would never call it Mandarin. It's the national standard, but it replaces Wu, that's Shanghainese. The fourth largest language group in the world are people who speak Wu, and we never even heard of them. Cantonese, Min, Sichuanese, not to mention Manchurian, Mongolian, Uyghur, Tibetan, one of the things that the European empires did is they provided a universal language, and pretty much after 1945, that has become English. Now, there will always be the debate on whether that's British English, but years ago, I had Swiss friends who used to say they drove their English professor crazy in Zurich because they talk like people in American movies. So I don't think there's there will be, and there are automatic translations, I think, but there does have to be communication, and there is no reason why you can't have an international order where corporate entities have the same basic regulations and standards across the board, and non-government organizations do. I mean, the whole idea, whether it works or not, is that a more integrated world, this is the basic globalist mantra, a more integrated world means a more peaceful world, because people are not going to want to risk the stability, the livelihoods, the profits, whatever, of going to war. I think the argument against that is there are always going to be people who decide it's worth risking everybody else's livelihood for them to get ahead. You know, what do you do with those people? So anyway, I mean, I'm not pessimistic, but I will say this much: if we are going to live in an integrated world where everybody expects to be prosperous, and we're going to try to share some kind of standards, I think you have to start with the non-ideological standards, the sort of practical standards. And secondly, you have to work at it. It's just like anything else. If you want a family, you know, you can't, you have a family and, you know, Uncle Ned is annoyed that nobody laughs at his jokes at Thanksgiving dinner. Well, it wouldn't hurt to laugh at a couple of his jokes, you know. That's, you have to actually have people who want to solve problems rather than just make the headlines. I don't have a solution to that.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anyone who would like to unmute their mic? I have one more question in the chat, but I'm holding that in case there's some.
If I
Yes,
may,
sure.
I'm the gentleman that put the two questions. I have to disagree with Mr. Ward, because the fact of the matter is everything he said is a historical basis. And if we're going to think or project forward, we really need to start thinking in terms of the Chinese specifically are obsessed, or they will require themselves to be the world order, period, amen. It's 1.4 billion people. The fact that they're fractioned off by subsets of languages is irrelevant. The Chinese will gladly learn English, because that makes it easier to influence, to control, to purchase, to leverage those English-speaking countries. And because we don't speak Chinese as well, it's quite possible, no, I believe it is reality, there are two faces. There's the Chinese face, and then there's the business English-speaking face. Mr. Ward, you projected that, you know, we have an economy based upon approximately $50,000 per year, where the Chinese has $6,000 per year. I suspect that their middle class is growing, but from a standpoint of being in foreign countries myself, I'm pretty sure that the $6,000 man would love to be a $12,000 man, and there's only one place they can raise their average, and that's to take away money from the $50,000 per year man. So we are at risk, even though we're only 330,000. I think that there's a war going with pragmatists versus idealists, versus we don't care, we are ists, as long as we have economic power and leverage that over societies. So again, I put it back to you, Mr. Ward. Although your presentation has been wonderfully, a wonderful tour down memory lane, I don't hear yet anything you've projected or possibly offered that could possibly change the whole dynamic of to the 21st century, and especially those generation of young people following up in my old paths.
Let me just say a few things. It was not my intention at the beginning of this to lay out a path for the future, but rather to give people some background when they participate in the Camden Conference to understand the issues that Europe is facing. And this presentation is largely about Europe and its background. The use of different incomes is entirely hypothetical, and all it is a genuine, I think, realistic criticism of judging a country or an economy by its size alone. they're regardless of who has the largest economy, the United States has the most sophisticated economy in the world, and it's going to be a long time before somebody duplicates that. I mean, we can do damage to ourselves, but right now we control what is in effect the reserve currency of the world. That's the US dollar. I mean, without getting into detail, I have to say I don't share the idea that China is out to take over the world. The Chinese are out to make this a 150 years since 1842 goal for all Chinese leaders. And this isn't a discussion about China. This is about Europe. So I won't go into it. But the Chinese have a view of where China should be and what China should be. And it has never historically involved dominating the world. That's pretty much a European idea. And, I had a wonderful professor when I was an undergraduate who used to use the term strategic narcissism. And that was when great countries believe that everybody else sees the world the way they do and wants to be just like they are. And I don't think that that's defensible. And I do think that countries can learn and can deal with one another, and the pie can be made bigger. You don't need to take, the pie is not a standard size, and if somebody else gets more, you get less. I think that's a fallacy. And I think the US economy has proved that over and over and over again. I mean, we keep growing, we have issues, but for God's sake, we keep bringing in new people, having new people, and people prosper. That I think can be done. The question from a European point of view is, Europeans, what is Europe's place going to be in all of this? And I think there is a place, but it has to somehow recognize European history. I will quote here Winston Churchill, who in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when Europe and the United States were trying to adjust their relationship after the war, the Europeans constantly complained that the American ideas and the American policies just paid so little regard to the lessons of history. And Churchill said, I tell the Europeans that Americans have so little concern about history because they have so little of it. And I tell the Americans, the Europeans are obsessed with history because it's all they have. We are not going to have a world where people cooperate unless there is some recognition that people are different, and how do you respect that? And I know we're going through a period where we are very critical of ourselves, but by and large, we're a pretty good example of how you tolerate differences. Not perfect, nobody is. And the Europeans have come an immense way since 1945 in figuring out practical ways for countries to deal with one another and not get caught in the trap of ideology. So I don't know what the future is going to, but there is enough foundation around the world that you can figure out how people can work with one another if you're willing to do it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Matt. I think that's a good note to end on. And I really appreciate your taking the journey here to be with us. And I know that we ought to have everybody unmute themselves and give Matt a hearty hand, or if you're wanting to do it this way, let Matt know that you enjoyed his presentation. And
Thank
Em,
you.
who do we have next?
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
believe. Thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you, Matt. I believe our, let's see, January 6th will be Paige Hurlinger from Bowdoin will be speaking here, again, over Zoom.
Okay, okay.
And her topic is,
I don't actually know her topic. I haven't heard it yet.
I am not sure myself. I don't know what the topic is either, but it's January 6th. Okay, 6:30. Again, Matt Ward, thank you very much. And
It was my pleasure. My
Have a
pleasure.
good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Okay, thanks.
Have a wonderful night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Good night.